Good night, too.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see some very familiar faces out here. Well, welcome to our event, Striving for Justice, with a wonderful speaker, Alessandra Harris. This event is one of many that we are using to celebrate Black History Month. Our theme is celebrating Black excellence in the name of resistance. Alessandra is the author of 4 books now. One on the way. Okay, 3 and a half, 1 on the way. And without
Different racial, ethnic, and religious groups in the United States could argue that they have faced racism and discrimination. Since September 11th, dozens of people who live in the Middle Eastern have been racially profiled, and a Muslim ban was proposed in 2017. That same year, a group of white nationalists held a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, protesting the plans to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was a commander of the Confederate Army during the Civil War. White men marched with lit tiki torches and, among other slogans, chanted, "Jews will not replace us." James Field, who has been described as a neo-Nazi, drove his car into a crowd and killed Heather Heyer, a 32-year-old counter purchaser. In 2020, after the start of the pandemic, we saw the rise of hate speech and crimes against the Asian American and Pacific Island representation. Is that better? Today, during Black History Month, I'm going to speak specifically about the racism towards African Americans that many people thought was gone, but actually hiding in plain sight. After the election of Barack Obama in 2008, some people claimed America was now a post-racial society. However, the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012 and then the acquittal of his murderer, George Zimmerman, in 2013, led to the birth of the new movement, Black Lives Matter. After Michael Brown's murder in 2015, BLM protests in Ferguson, Missouri, awakened the country and the world to the conditions faced by many Black Americans. Throughout different cities in the country, the murder of Black people in their communities by police and the protests that followed shattered the illusion that Black people were not still being racially profiled and murdered because of the color of their skin. The murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor in 2020 led to the largest social protest movement in U.S. history. But now we are in the throes of what Martin Luther King Jr. termed a whitewash. Books are being banned, teachers and professors are being threatened for teaching Black history. An AP African American Studies course has been modified after Florida's rejection of it. A total of 35 states so far have signed into law or proposed legislation banning or restricting the teaching of critical race theory, and the Black Lives Matter movement has been vilified. But to understand why we find ourselves here again, we must revisit American history. Our nation was founded by the colonization, genocide, and displacement of indigenous peoples. One recent demographic study has suggested that the total population of indigenous people in the Americas at the time of first contact with Europeans in 1492 was roughly 60 million, or 10% of humanity's global total. And by 1600, as a result of contact with Europeans, 56 million of them were dead. Around 12 million Africans were captured and trafficked to the Americas. 6 million were killed in Africa during slave raids, and 2 million died during the Middle Passage voyage. People have tried to minimize the enslavement of African Americans in the United States by stating slavery had been practiced for centuries throughout the world. However, it wasn't until the transatlantic slave trade that a group of people were enslaved on account of their skin color alone. Social scientists have agreed that there is no biological basis for the concept of race. It is a social construct that was created and weaponized to permanently subjugate Black people and subjugate and exploit Indigenous and brown people in their land for the profit of white European colonizers. The term used for race-based slavery is chattel slavery. The word chattel shares a common root with cattle, and it means dehumanized beasts of burden. When white people began to enslave Black people, they did so by denying the very humanity of Black people who they enslaved. Some white people who thought Black people were human thought they were a different species of human than whites. In Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, Thomas Jefferson, who was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "I advanced it therefore as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time or circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind." Jefferson did not believe that the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness extended to Black people, because to him and the majority of white American thinkers, Black people were not fully human. In her book, Until We Reckon, Danielle Sarad argues that the white supremacist view that people of African descent were subhuman was a necessary tool for whites to allow and inflict inhumane violence on the people they enslaved. Quote, "It is hard for anyone to inflict extreme pain on people we see as fully human and whose experience we see as reflective of our own. Our capacity for empathy is powerful, and when it is present, it interferes with our ability to hurt others. The act of empathizing is one of linkage. We draw on our own experience to imagine the experience of another person. So to imagine how extreme punishment would feel, lashings, beatings, burnings, and more, we would have to imagine how it would feel to survive it ourselves. But if we can persuade ourselves that there is something about the person we seek to punish that is fundamentally different from us, less than us, we become more capable of disabling our empathy, of telling ourselves that the pain they feel will not be like ours because they are not like us. In that way, racism is a profound enabler of cruelty by white people, because it provides a way to bypass the otherwise natural and often overpowering capacity for empathy. In so doing, it augments white people's capacity to engage in punishment that exceeds what a person would otherwise regard as appropriate or allowable within shared human community. In 1662, colonial America, a law was passed that stated the children of enslaved women were also slaves. Slavery became a condition that was passed down for generations. Not only were marriages between two Black people not legally binding because as property, the enslaved could not enter into a contract, but the children they did have from their union could be abused, sold, and removed from their family at any moment. Equally devastating for Black women was the reality of rape and sexual abuse perpetuated against them by the white men who enslaved them. Not only was there no legal recourse for a Black woman to protect herself, but any children born from rape resulted in the enslavement of those children as well. I mentioned Thomas Jefferson earlier, who questioned the humanity of Black people. Yet that did not prevent him from sexually abusing Sally Hemings, who was only 14 at the first time he raped her. I say rape because a 14-year-old who was enslaved did not have an option to consent to the adult male who had complete control over her life. Hemmings would go on to bear 6 children for Jefferson, who were also enslaved. Jefferson recorded the births of his children with Sally in his farm book that contained detailed information about farming activities, his livestock, and people he enslaved. He enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime, which is the most of any U.S. president. The rape and impregnation of Black women who were enslaved and children born out of such circumstances were further contradictory proof of the humanity of Black people. While there is no way to definitively answer the question of how many white men sexually assaulted the Black girls and women they enslaved, there are documentation and clues. In the 1619 project essay, Race, Dorothy Roberts explains an analysis by historian Velma Jennings of 514 narratives of formerly enslaved people found that 12% of the female authors referred to experiences of coerced sex by women. Of those women, 35% had fathers who were white men or who had given birth to children fathered by white men. Jennings noted that the numbers were likely far larger given the reluctance of recently freed Black women to discuss such private matters with their white interviewers. Census records show that in 1850, roughly 11% of the enslaved population was classified as mulatto or mixed race. A 2020 study sampling DNA conducted by Joanna Mountain, the Senior Director of Research at 23andMe, has also reinforced the historical record. The research included the DNA of 50,000 people, including 30,000 people with African ancestry whose grandparents were born in a region touched by the transatlantic slave trade. Roberts wrote, the researchers found that although a majority of the more than 12 million enslaved people who arrived in the Americas were men, enslaved women contributed more to the current gene pool. The genetic contribution of European men to the ancestry of African Americans is 3 times greater than that of European women. This means that enslaved men were more likely to die before they were able to have children, and that enslaved women were often raped by white men and forced to bear their children. However, for as long as people of African descent were brought to the Americas in chains and enslaved in forced labor camps, they fought in different ways against their enslavement. We know the stories of people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman who escaped slavery, and there were many, many more. Many Black people drew upon the biblical book of Exodus, of Moses leading the Israelites from Egyptian slavery, and believed that God would free those bound in American slavery too. This belief in God as a liberator was considered so dangerous to the institution of slavery that it was against the law for enslaved Black people to gather for religious services or read the Bible. I want to give a content warning that the next 2 slides are graphic and depict lynching. After the Civil War, when slavery was abolished, the belief in white supremacy, that white people were superior to Black people and had a God-given right to dominate and control Black people, continued. It manifested in brutal Jim Crow segregation, sharecropping, and convict leasing, which was a form of neo-slavery, whereby hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the South were forced to work for free in conditions often worse than slavery, under the threat of whippings, torture, or death. You may be familiar with the book Just Mercy or the film by the same name. The author, Brian Stevenson, is a civil rights attorney who is also the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. EGI spent years and thousands of hours researching documented lynchings in the United States. Based on its findings, there was almost 6,500 documented racial terror lynchings that occurred from the end of the Civil War to 1950, whereby white Americans sought to exert control and inflict terror upon Black Americans to keep them in their place. This slide depicts an actual lynching postcard that was sold in 1911. Mother and son, Laura and Elvin Nelson, were African Americans lynched on May 25th, 1911 in Oklahoma. Before they were lynched, Laura was raped and LD was castrated. Here's an excerpt from the James Cone book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Lynching became a white spectacle in which prominent newspapers like the Atlanta Constitution announced to the public the place, date, and time of the expected hanging and burning of Black victims. Often as many as 10 to 20,000 men, women, and children attended the event. It was a family affair, a ritual celebration of white supremacy, where women and children were often given the first opportunity to torture Black victims, burning Black flesh and cutting off genitals, fingers, toes, and ears as souvenirs. Postcards were made from the photographs taken of Black victims, with white lynchers and onlookers smiling as they struck a pose for the camera. They were sold for 10 to 25 cents to members of the crowd, who then mailed them to relatives and friends, often with a note saying something like this: "This is the barbecue we had last night." My 8th grade son went on a class trip last September to Washington, D.C., and one place they visited was the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. He sent us a picture of a quote from one survivor named Abe Hesberg that said, quote, "There were not 6 million Jews murdered. There was one murder 6 million times." That allowed me the new perspective to humanize the suffering and murder that took place during the Holocaust. So too for Americans, we have to humanize each brutal incident of a person being hung, burned, beaten, and tortured nearly 6,500 times in our country because they were Black or people of color. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is pictured, opened to the public on April 26, 2018, and is the nation's first memorial dedicated to the legacy of enslaved Black people. People terrorized by lynching and humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and people of color burdened with contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. In the book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Harvard historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad explains that as soon as slavery ended, the notion of Black criminality emerged. He states, quote, "From the 1890s through the first 4 decades of the 20th century, Black criminality would become one of the most commonly cited and longest lasting justifications for Black inequality and mortality in the modern urban world." Lynchings of Black people, and especially Black men, were justified because of the myth of Black criminality. Today, it's socially unacceptable to claim a Black person as inferior or deserves to be discriminated against because they are Black. However, it is socially acceptable to dehumanize, discriminate against, and punish people who are labeled criminal, which in the US is a label easily applied to individual Black people and entire low-income Black neighborhoods. Michelle Alexander, who in 2010 wrote the seminal book, The New Jim Crow, brought to the nation's attention the new form of anti-Black racism that emerged after the Civil Rights Movement. She wrote, quote, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals, and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you are afforded scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Today's lynching is a felony charge. Today's lynching is incarceration. Today's lynch mobs are professionals. They have a badge, they have a law degree. A felony is a modern way of saying, I'm going to hang you up and burn you. Once you get that death, you're on fire. The NAACP defines lynching as the public killing of an individual who has not received any due process. These executions were often carried out by lawless mobs, though police officers did participate under the pretext of justice. If we use this definition, the police killings of unarmed Black men who are perceived as criminal threats simply because of the color of their skin and brutally executed with no due process, continue the nation's long history of lynching. Pictured are George Floyd and Daniel Prude, who was killed in New York in 2020 while suffering a mental health episode. I'll speak more about police killings later. The United States is the world's leader in incarceration, with the largest amount of people in its prisons and jails, 2 million, and the highest rate of incarceration. Over the last 40 years, the incarceration has increased by 500%. A 2020 report by the Council on Criminal Justice's Task Force on Long Sentences examined all people sentenced to life, including for violent and nonviolent offenses, and compared the U.S. to the rest of the world. It was found that the U.S. is an outlier in the length of incarceration of offenders. Black people make up 14% of the U.S. population, but account for 46% of people serving a life sentence, and 55% of those serving life without the possibility of parole. The United States holds 40% of the globe's people serving life sentences, as well as the majority, 83% of individuals sentenced to life without parole. One of the authors, Lila Kazmian, professor in the Department of Sociology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, stated, quote, the analysis of the U.S. states suggests that sentencing laws may be a response to the size of the Black population and racial differences in support for more punitive policies, and that white public support influences policy adoption. Last weekend, I was listening to an interview with Reuben Miller, who recently won a MacArthur Genius Grant Award and has written about mass incarceration and the barriers to reentry in his book, Halfway Home. He cited a number of shocking statistics. 1 in 3 African Americans will spend time in jail or prison. 60% of Black boys who drop out of high school will spend time in jail or prison. 30% of Black boys who graduate high school will still spend time in jail or prison. 49% of Black boys and 38% of white boys will be arrested before they turn 23. Additionally, 1 in 4 African American children have a parent who is or was incarcerated. However, historians, lawyers, and civil rights activists have concluded that the nation did not become the world's largest incarcerator by accident. The war on crime that was first started under the Johnson administration and the war on drugs has been proven to disproportionately target and criminalize the Black community. While President Nixon called for a war on drugs, it was not until President Reagan's administration that a full-blown war was waged. Two major societal changes coincided with the launch of the drug war. An economic downturn led to massive unemployment in Black communities, and crack cocaine infiltrated Black neighborhoods. Due to globalization and the offshoring of industrial factories located in inner cities, manufacturing jobs that once provided meaningful employment to African Americans and especially Black males with low levels of formal education disappeared. A report published in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science found that in 1970, more than 70% of African Americans were working in the metropolitan areas of Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C., and that they held blue-collar jobs. However, between 1972 and 1982, the U.S. Census of manufacturers showed dramatic losses in manufacturing jobs. New York City lost 30%, Detroit lost 41%, and Chicago lost 47%. By 1984, the Black unemployment rate had nearly quadrupled since the 1950s. By 1987, the industrial employment of Black men sunk to 28%. The unemployment rate for Black youth climbed to between 40 and 60%. At the same time, white flight led to millions of white people living in these areas, moving to the suburbs, taking their taxable income, businesses, and resources with them. Michelle Alexander explained how in 1984, the Drug Enforcement Agency launched Operation Pipeline that trained police to conduct unreasonable and discriminatory stops and searches throughout the United States. The federal program, administered by over 300 state and local law enforcement agencies, trains state and local law enforcement officers to use pretextual traffic stops and consent searches on a large scale for drug interdiction. Officers learn how to use a minor traffic stop and leverage it into a search for drugs. In 1985, crack cocaine made its way into the economically depressed Black neighborhoods, and there was an increase in both violence as unemployed residents fought to control the drug distribution channels and drug dependency as people became addicted to the new drug. In 1986, Congress passed a law to establish mandatory minimum sentences for drug trafficking offenses, which treated crack and cocaine powder offenses using a 100-to-1 ratio. Under this policy, a person convicted for selling as small an amount as 5 grams of crack would incur the same severe minimum sentence as someone who sold 500 grams of powdered cocaine. This is one of the most egregious examples of racial disparity in the criminal legal system. Under President Clinton, the 1994 crime bill led to a major expansion in mass incarceration. Alexander explained that by 1996, the penal budget doubled the amount that had been allocated for welfare and food stamps. Funding that had once been used for public housing was being redirected to prison construction. During Clinton's tenure, the government slashed funding for public housing by $17 billion, which was a reduction of 61%, and increased funding for corrections by $19 billion, which was an increase of 171%, which Alexander stated effectively made the construction of prisons the nation's main housing program for the urban poor. I want to pause here and say the National Drug Abuse Studies from the 90s found that white, Black, and Hispanic people use drugs at roughly the same rate. That's still the case. And Black high schoolers actually use drugs at a lower rate than their white counterparts. So the drug war wasn't so much about ending drugs as it was about targeting Black drug users. The vast majority of those arrested were for relatively minor crimes, and simple possession of marijuana accounted for 80% of drug arrests in the 90s. A 2000 Human Rights Watch report confirmed the racial bias inherent in the war on drugs and who it targeted and criminalized. It found in 7 states, African Americans constituted 80 to 90% of all those sent to prison on drug charges. In at least 15 states, Black people were admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate from 20 to 57 times greater than that of white men. When the war on drugs gained full steam in the mid-1980s, prison admissions for African Americans skyrocketed, nearly quadrupling in 3 years, and then increasing steadily until it reached in 2000 a level more than 26 times the level in 1983. However, the war on drugs wasn't just a catchy slogan. Police waged and continue to wage an actual war against predominantly low-income Black and brown neighborhoods. Bradley Bacco, author of the book Rise of a Warrior Cop, said, quote, "When you arm police like soldiers and outfit them with military weapons and train them on military tactics and tell them they're fighting a war, whether it's a war on crime or drugs or looters and rioters, they're going to start seeing themselves as soldiers and seeing the people they serve less as citizens with rights and more as potential threats. And that's what we're seeing." In 1996, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which made the Pentagon's temporary authority to give weapons of war to local law enforcement agencies permanent and expanded its purview to counterterrorism as well, creating the 1033 program. On May 12, 2021, the ACLU released an analysis of the history of the 1033 program. Since the program was created in 1996, the U.S. military has given roughly 10,000 law enforcement agencies $7.4 billion worth of equipment, including grenade launchers, batons, combat vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of rifles. From 2011 to 2014, the military distributed more than 29,000 military-grade rifles to 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Today, state and local law enforcement possess more than 60,000 military-grade rifles, 1,500 combat-ready trucks and tanks, 500 unmanned ground vehicles, and dozens of military aircraft, machine gun parts, bayonets, and even an inert rocket launcher. Law enforcement attached to K-12 schools, colleges, and universities have received millions of dollars in heavily militarized equipment. Speaking of law enforcement in school, a 2018 ACLU report, Cops and No Counselors, How the Lack of School Mental Health Staff is Harming Students, found the following. 1.7 million students are in schools with police, no counselors. 3 million students are in schools with police, no nurses. 6 million students are in schools with police, but no school psychologists. 10 million students are in schools with police, but no social workers. 14 million students are in schools with police, but no counselor, nurse, psychologist, or social worker. Arming schools with police in urban neighborhoods characterized by low income and high violence at the expense of adequately staffing counselors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers is setting students up for incarceration, not success. Students who are not receiving social, emotional, and mental health support they need, and instead are surveilled and policed at school, are at a greater risk of failing or dropping out of school, which leads to a higher chance of future incarceration. A 2019 Vera Institute of Justice report found that in the United States, law enforcement are making an arrest every 3 seconds. However, contrary to popular belief that police are taking dangerous criminals off the street in order to protect communities, the data actually showed that non-serious, low-level offenses such as drug abuse violations and disorderly conduct make up over 80% of arrests, and fewer than 5% of arrests are for serious violent offenses. The 2021 New York Times series Deadly Police Encounters revealed that hundreds of unarmed motorists across the country have been murdered by police after vehicle stops for nonviolent offenses. An investigation spanning the previous 5 years from 2016 had found police officers have killed more than 400 drivers or passengers that were not wielding a gun or a knife or under pursuit for a violent crime, a rate of more than one a week. Of those officers, only 5 have been convicted for the killings. The investigation also found that while police, juries, the judges underscore the danger associated with the law enforcement profession, vehicle stops specifically, actual data demonstrates vehicle stops are not as dangerous as presumed. Of the roughly 280 officers who have been killed on duty since late 2016, 170 died in accidents on the job, compared to 60 of the officers killed by motorists they had pulled over. The Times found an officer's chance of being killed at any vehicle stop are less than 1 in 3.6 million, excluding accidents. At stops for common traffic infractions, the odds are as low as 1 in 6.5 million, according to a 2019 study by Jordan Blair Woods, a law professor at the University of Arkansas. In 2022, the police killed 1,183 people. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, although they are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed than white people. The majority of the police killings begin with traffic stops, mental health checks, nonviolent offenses where no crime was alleged. 1 in 3 of killings begin with an alleged violent crime. From 2013 through 2022, officers were not charged with the crime for killing someone in 98.1% of the cases. During that same time period, Chicago police killed Black people at 25 times higher rate than white people per population. Minneapolis and Boston police killed Black people at 28 times higher rate. In 2023, we've already seen notable police killings of Keenan Anderson, whose cousin is Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrice Fullers, and the beating death of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee. I want to talk about Memphis for a minute because it ties together everything I've discussed in this talk so far. Memphis is situated in the heart of the South's old Cotton Kingdom, where a large amount of enslaved Black people were forced to work for free under the threat of white violence. Martin Luther Jr. King was assassinated there. Today, it has a 26.5% poverty rate for Black residents. Though the Memphis Police Department receives 40% of the city's operating budget, the department's clearance rates, meaning the amount of time solved, are only 18.3% for rape cases, and only 23.2% of all crimes against a person result in arrests in Memphis. In contrast, more than 89% of reported drug violations result in arrests. So like most predominantly Black cities, the police are more focused on waging a drug war than actually solving real crimes like rape or homicide. You might remember last year, a white woman named Eliza Fletcher, who was a school teacher and mother of 2 young children, disappeared in the early morning of September 2 after jogging near the University of Memphis. Fletcher was from a wealthy family, and her disappearance gained national news coverage. On September 4th, a Black man named Theophilus Henderson was charged with Fletcher's kidnapping, and the next day a law enforcement search for Fletcher found her deceased with a gunshot wound to the back of her head. What came to light after Abstin Henderson's arrest is that Alicia Franklin, a young Black woman, had reported to police in September of the previous year that Abstin Henderson had raped her at gunpoint. Franklin gave the police detectives Abstin Henderson's phone number, home address, social media handle, and a description of his car. In spite of the evidence provided by Franklin, the police did not investigate or arrest Abstin Henderson. Had Franklin's report of rape been acted upon by the police, Abstin Henderson would have had much lower chance of committing another crime and killing Fletcher. For the most part, the police do not prevent crime from happening. If spending large sums of money on police and incarceration resulted in less crime, we would be the safest nation in the world, because we spend more money on policing and incarceration and we incarcerate more people than any other country in the history of the world. But we all know we're not close to the safest country. The reality is that the safest communities do not have the most police. The safest communities have the most resources, like high-wage jobs, well-funded public schools, grocery stores with fresh food, community spaces, and well-kept neighborhoods where people can afford to live. Currently, there are over 70 million Americans with an arrest record. In Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson summarized the social isolation people with convictions face. Quote, the collateral consequences of mass incarceration have been equally profound. We ban poor women and inevitably their children from receiving food stamps and public housing if they have prior drug convictions. We have created a new caste system that forces thousands of people into homelessness, bans them from living with their families and in their communities, and renders them virtually unemployable. We live in a segregated and unjust society where any Black person can be perceived as a threat and have the police called on them. A large number of Black neighborhoods experience poverty and social exclusion, and the majority of formerly incarcerated people are shut out from the American dream. I hope the way we look back on pictures of lynching horror and at the atrocities committed against Black people is the way future Americans will look at the viral videos of Black people being murdered by the police today. It won't be a common occurrence then that makes news one day and then fades into memory. But we have to work to eradicate police killings, racial injustice, and mass incarceration in order for that to happen. I'm going to end with this last slide about ways we can advocate for a more just society. End the war on drugs, end pretext traffic stops, or remove police from traffic duties and replace them with trained unarmed professionals. Train and staff clinicians to respond to mental health calls instead of police. Practice restorative justice in schools, the legal system, and prisons. Invest in violence interrupters, invest in social programs, and divest from prisons. Thank you, and I wanted to leave time in case anyone had any questions or comments.
What do you think the message is that Tyree was killed by 5 Black police?
I think the message is that police are trained and armed to carry out the war on drugs and to prevent crime, and that at this stage, because of the training and because of the militarization of the police, it doesn't matter if the police officer is white, Black, Hispanic, Asian. That's part of their training. So I think that what what we saw happen is that all the supposed reforms to policing failed at the same time. We had Black police officers, they were using supposedly less lethal methods. They were using a taser instead of guns. They had on body cameras, they were being recorded, and they still beat a man to death. So the question is not, will these reforms work? The question is, what else can we do to keep communities safe instead of only relying on policing?
Any thoughts on how crack infiltrated the Black community in the 80s?
Well, it's interesting because in the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander does say that the CIA admitted that they did not investigate where the crack cocaine was coming from, and that they believe it was coming from Nicaragua, which the US was engaged in the war that was going on with them. So unlike fentanyl today, where we're trying to figure out where is this coming from, can we close the borders, can we get to the source and stop it? That didn't happen with crack cocaine.
Well, my information is that crack cocaine is being brought into the country from the Contras who were involved in Nicaragua on the side of the America was destabilizing Nicaragua and the whole area down there. So it was very well known what was happening. It was part of the funding of the Contras who had been funded to overthrow the Nicaraguan government by the US.
Go ahead, Kathy.
When we were driving here, we drove past the city hall where we protested George Floyd's murder almost 3 years ago. And I feel like the same issues are recurring year after year. So like, is reform even possible at this point if like the system is inherently corrupt, or is a solution more just abolition?
Well, I think that we're getting to a point in the country where people are starting to understand that reform is not going to be enough to stop the police killings of Black people. And a recent study that was just done after Tyree Nichols' death was showing that less Americans believe that the police treat Black and white people equally, and less Americans believe that the police are trained to de-escalate and to police in a way that isn't gonna brutalize people. So I think that the American people need to start shifting away from thinking that just reforms are gonna change the situation, and start looking at other options and other ways that we can move past just policing. Maria, did you have?
I did. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about just what you just finished saying about how we can actually transform our government to have a lot less in law enforcement and more into the social programs. I was really impacted by the one slide that you showed where so many of the schools have police and yet no or very little support services and counseling for the students. How do you think we can make that transition?
Well, I think one thing that I just heard about that I thought was a positive change is that in Santa Rosa, they have a program called In Response. It's a pilot program where they have a team of a paramedic, a mental health clinician, and a housing advocate. They go out to respond to mental health calls or welfare calls, or when housing issues, when it's a housing issue. So instead of having police respond to those calls, you actually have a group of professionals respond to those calls instead. And I think that that's a really good program and what we need more of, because police are actually facing low levels of recruitment. Less people want to become police officers. And why are we expecting police to handle all of our society's problems? They're not trained for that. You know, they're not trained to handle mental health calls. They're not trained to handle people who are unhoused. And I don't think that they even necessarily have to respond to traffic incidents. So, and we've also seen in other parts of the country where they've changed the law, so police can no longer use the pretextual stops to stop people alone. So if it's just their registration, or if it's an air freshener dangling from their rearview mirror, or if it's one tail light out, police can no longer respond to those, can pull over a person just because of that. So I think that we're seeing slowly reforms that are happening. And let me just talk about restorative justice in schools for a second, because you mentioned how in the schools we have a situation where there's police, but not mental health professionals or social workers or even nurses in some instances. So with restorative justice, it's a way to look at when we talk about restorative justice, instead of it being that a person committed an offense and they're going to be punished for it. Someone committed harm, so we're going to harm them. Instead, it's looking at, okay, a harm was done. How can that person who caused the harm repair the harm? So if, for example, with students, instead of just saying this person did something, they're going to be suspended out of school, then it's saying, let's look at what happened and how can they repair that harm? How can they not commit that same offense again? And how can we keep them in the school? So I think it's changing the lens of the way that we're operating in this country to focus more on the humanity of the people and to focus on measures that are actually going to increase safety.
I just want to add that now that I'm retired, I often watch C-SPAN. And, you know, I get a chance to look at hearings on that various topics. And I really believe that you would be an excellent witness or provide good testimony for some of the reforms that the legislation, the federal legislators are trying to make in the system, because I really appreciate the way you have given the historical perspective and very truthfully explaining up to the current, I think, like what you said about the incident with Tyree Nichols, where all the things that we thought were reforms didn't save his life.
Along that same vein, there's a lot of pushback against educating people, especially at the higher levels of education, on historical inequities of, you know, Black people. So how do we make sure that people are being educated properly about the history of America, specifically as it relates to racism, when there's so much pushback by the Republican Party at this point?
Well, I think that that's where every single one of us in the room plays a part, because I think that it's all of our responsibilities when we have information about the history of racism and how it continues to affect us. It's our responsibility to have conversations with other people and to teach other people the truth and to give them resources to provide them, because you're right, like in a state like Florida and the 35 states that have banned what they call critical race theory, they don't want this history to be taught. And I think one of the reasons is because it does not make America look like the beacon of democracy that America claims that it is. And I think that with Black people are not wanting to become the minority that rules over white people or tells white people what to do. Black people have always just wanted to be included in the democracy. And I think that a lot of times with what people are afraid of is that when they say that we're gonna become a majority minority, is that white people are gonna somehow be under oppression. That Black people are under oppression. Black people don't want to oppress another racial group. They just want to be able to participate in democracy as equal citizens without being criminalized or possibly brutalized because of the color of their skin. Ebony, did you have anything else, or do you think it's a good time to end?
I think that we can go ahead and close out here. We are streaming live, so I was giving the live streamers a chance to ask questions. There are 10 of them,
Okay.
and they've been watching the whole time.
Okay, one other question here.
Okay, I just want to point out one thing, that is that in Philadelphia, the city council passed a ordinance that banned basically these pretextual traffic stops. So the police can no longer, just stop you and then say, oh, your tail light was out or something like that, and then search your car and do all that. And I think that that is really the root of a lot of the police brutality or the traffic stops. I think you pointed out in an earlier fact that a lot of the murders and stuff occurred on the traffic stop. And Tyree Rice is the perfect example. They don't even know why he was stopped.
Well, and the other thing that's interesting that research has shown, the states that have decriminalized marijuana actually have less traffic stops because the police aren't searching for drugs. So it's shown that when police are no longer are looking for drugs specifically, that there's less of the stops and less of the racially biased stops. Ebony, was there questions to be answered?
No, but there's also a time lag,
Okay.
but I think we've beat it. So if anybody was going to ask a question, they would have asked it by now.
Okay. And one more in the back.
One more, I think sometimes the issue related to critical race theory is that people, at least one of the arguments I've heard is that it is taught in order to shame white people or to make them feel bad, and guilty, even though it was their ancestors that caused them, not them. So do you have any suggestions or thoughts on how we can make people an ally and actually not try to avoid the perception of accusation, like that? Can we somehow change the narrative so that people feel like they're involved regardless of, if they're invested in processes like this?
Well, I think that it's important for the history to speak for itself. And if people, for example, as a Black person, when I would be in school and learn about slavery, I felt bad to hear that the way Black people were treated. And as someone whose ancestors were enslaved, I personally felt, bad about that. So if a white person hears the history, but feels bad because they think that maybe one of their ancestors enslaved someone, I think that that's a healthy emotion. And I don't think that that should be prevented, just like a Black person shouldn't be prevented from feeling bad because their ancestor was enslaved. I think, and the other thing about critical race theory is not being taught in K-12 schools. That's a lie. It's misleading. Critical race theory is complex and it's usually taught in law schools or if it's taught in colleges. But in what's happening in K-12 schools is that anything about history that does not look favorable for white Americans is considered dangerous now. And I think that that we as citizens need to stand up to that as much as we can.
Yeah, in my understanding, is critical race theory is about racist institutions, organizations, and systems. It's not about any individual and what they did or their ancestors did. So I think that's just kind of a bogus issue.
Yeah, I agree.
Saying that, oh, I can't, I don't want to send my kids over there because they're gonna feel bad. It's not about individuals, it's about systems. That's why I teach in college. That's why you teach in college.
All right, we can take one more question and then we're going to bring our wonderful chat to a close. Do you have any additional questions? I'm gonna hand clap for Alessandra.
Just want to know about your upcoming nonfiction novel? No. So I do have a book that's gonna be published in the fall that will have all this information and a lot more. So if you Google my name, Alessandra Harris, my different social media and website will populate, and you can just follow me anywhere or subscribe on Amazon, and you'll get a notification when that comes out.
I want to thank you all for coming, especially on this rainy afternoon. I swear the sky just opened up and started pouring down rain when I thought to go outside, so we're glad you all made it. I just want to let you know that we do have more Black History Month events going on at the library and at our various satellites. And if you didn't already, if you want to pick up one of these flyers, it'll let you know what's happening, when and where. Thank you all and drive safely.
It's a little chilly, right? You want to stop this? Careful. I was very glad you made something.
That's a meet you. Nice to meet you. You also work at presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful.
A lot of it, what I've been trying to push forward in my years there. And still meet with resistance. So.
In the name of resistance.
Exactly. But.
Oh, yes, now that's when you walk. Thank you for promoting our. Okay. Okay. You sound like me. I don't do it.
Yeah, your pictures.
Like you.
Do you want to stop the license?
Oh, yeah, we can stop.
I'm like,
We're not doing it. Oh, I think I have to stop it on Zoom.
No, I guess it's-
So, and- All right.